So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about leaf structure. So even though there are autotrophs that are not plants, most of our discussion is going to involve looking at photosynthesis in plants as opposed to cyanobacteria or some protists. So really important for us to understand our plant anatomy. So we're going to start with looking at the structure of the leaf. So what this diagram is showing is if we were to take a leaf, for instance, and look at and slice it down its cross section. So imagine that here is our leaf and there's our cross section of the leaf. What would we see? So this would be the top of the leaf, and down on the underside here would be the underside of the leaf. And so let's start by looking from the top down. So at the top of the leaf I'm not talking about the layer of cells so much as just the coating here. This is called the cuticle. And what the cuticle is this waxy, water-resistant covering, if you will, on the top of the leaf. And its job is to protect the leaf from excess light absorption and also to prevent excess water evaporation, right? We don't want our leaf to dehydrate. So the cuticle is there as a protection mechanism. So right underneath that, we're going to see the upper epidermis. So the epidermis, regardless of whether we're talking about the upper epidermis or the lower epidermis, is just this transparent layer of cells just below the cuticle. And you might be saying, well, why would it be colorless? Isn't it a plant? Isn't it supposed to have some chlorophyll? Well, here we're not going to see a lot of chlorophyll, and the main function of it, think of it almost like a window of sorts, is that it's going to allow light to just simply pass through it. So in some ways it acts as a bit of a protection. And so all the light is going to be able to pass right through that epidermal layer and into the cells beneath. So now we're going to get into what are called collectively the mesophyll layers. So the mesophyll, middle, I think is what that means. So in the middle, in between the epidermal layers, we're going to see two different and distinct types of cells. We're going to see what's referred to as the palisade mesophyll. So notice that those cells are nice and neatly organized and are right beneath the upper epidermis. And below that, we see what's referred to as the spongy mesophyll. So spongy, think like lots of little air pockets, and that's exactly what this layer of cells resembles. In between that, you might see some sort of vascular bundle. So remember, we talked about the xylem and the phloem briefly in grade 11 biology. So a vascular bundle will sort of appear in that way. There are some other distinct identifiers of the vascular bundle, and I'm going to see if I can pull up a microscope slide here in a bit for us to look at a real life example of a leaf cross section. Okay, so our palisade mesophyll is sort of there just to help protect as well. It's just a nice concentrated layer of cells with tons and tons of chloroplasts. So we're going to see tons and tons of chloroplasts, so lots of photosynthetic action going on here. Then we have below, also in the spongy mesophyll, these cells will each contain lots and lots of chloroplasts as well. But the difference is that there are air pockets there. And so you'll remember that for photosynthesis to occur, we need to have carbon dioxide. And for when photosynthesis occurs, there is going to be some oxygen produced. So those little pockets are going to house those gases. And so the structure will allow for that. Now, let's look at the lower epidermis. Nothing really big to know there except that it just exists. But within it, we're going to find a special type of cell that is called the guard cell. So the guard cells will come in pairs like that. And they basically do as their name suggests. They guard the opening into the spongy mesophyll. Now remember, the spongy mesophyll, as we just discussed, is going to hold some very important gases that are critical for cellular respiration. So the guard cells guide the opening to where those gases can be exchanged. So the hole, or the opening itself, that the guard cells either block or create is called a stoma or a stomate. Right, so when the guard cells choose to open, that will allow for carbon dioxide to move into the spongy mesophyll, into the leaf. And once there's excess oxygen within the spongy mesophyll, then that oxygen can leave via the stoma. Okay. It's also the site for excess water evaporation as well. And so the light levels and temperature levels will affect the opening and closing of that stomate, which we will talk about in our next lesson. All right, so here I found a diagram that I think will work. So what we're looking at here is sort of just a microscope slide that was made of a leaf cross-section. And so you can see up here, are our clear or transparent upper epidermis dermal cells. You can see here the palisade mesophyll, sometimes referred to as the palisade parenchyma or parenchyma. That's just another term used for the same thing. But you can see the nice organization of that palisade mesophyll layer, as opposed to our spongy mesophyll, which we see in here, with lots and lots of air pockets for gases to accumulate or to be stored. Here we can see a few different vascular bundles here, where we have either xylem or phloem, but we're not to worry about that so much right now. But if we zoom in, I liked that we could see here on the left-hand side where it looks like we have some guard cells with a stomate that is opened, right? So every so often you can sort of see where those stomates and guard cells might be. This looks like it might be a guard cell that's closed, hard to tell. Here's another picture as well, and here we can see a bunch of different guard cells here guarding that stomate. And again, we can see that characteristic palisade mesophyll and our spongy mesophyll, along with our upper and our lower epidermal layers as well. All right, so what I want you to do right now is create a table for yourself as I have here. I want you to, we're going to be going through each of those terms that we just discussed. I want to see how you make out with it. I want to see whether you can recall what it is that what is the structure and the function of each of the components. So try to pause the video and guess for yourself and at each stage, and then see how you do. So the cuticle, if we're talking about the cuticle, it's primarily a waxy coating, and its job is to protect the leaf from excess light absorption and also excess water evaporation, particularly in really sunny or hot weather. The epidermal layer. It is basically a transparent layer of cells that's going to allow light to pass through it. It's going to allow for it's sort of like a window of sorts that will allow light to pass through. It's protective, but it will also allow the light to reach those cells below it in the mesophyll layers that are filled with chloroplasts. And so that brings me to my next subject, which is the spongy and palisade mesophyll layers. So that is the layer, of course, as discussed, where we're going to see the most concentration, the highest concentration of chloroplasts per cell. We're going to see, though, that the distinction between the palisade mesophyll is that, the cells are nice and tightly packed, whereas in the spongy mesophylls cells, we're going to see just them being very loosely packed. And that's because of those gas pockets that we should expect to see. So a lot of photosynthetic activity happening there. So the guard cells and the stomates, and just to be clear, the guard cells are the cells themselves, and the stomata or the stomates are the whole. So we would say, it just occurred to me that you might be wondering, well, why is she calling it different names? So let me be clear about that. So often, as you know in biology, there are some Latin derivatives of words. So in English, we would say one stomate. In Latin, we would say one stoma. If in English, we would say There are many stomates, and add an S to make it plural, but the plural of stoma is stomata. Okay, so maybe I should write that down. Let me just do that. So there I've written a little bit out for you. So, again, in English, we would say one stomate, two stomates. In Latin, we would say, one stoma, multiple stomata. And I hope that that helps. So on to the next little bit. So we know that the guard cells are sort of little kidney-shaped cells. They're in the lower epidermal layer, and they're arranged in pairs. Their job is to essentially guard the opening of the stomate. So the stomate is actually the hole, and it's connected to those air spaces we talked about in the spongy mesophyll. Okay, and their job, as we mentioned, is to regulate the exchange of important gases. We want CO2 to go into the leaf because, of course, it is a reactant in photosynthesis. Maybe I'll just quickly rewrite the equation for photosynthesis. We're going to have CO2 plus H2O going in along with some light energy, and that's going to give us some sugar. So sugar and some oxygen. So we want the CO2 to go in, but we're also going to want the oxygen to come out. So the stomate's going to regulate that, and the guard cell. Right? So if there's excess water vapor, right? If the plant is getting a little bit too hot, think of it like sweating for us, right? Excess water vapor will also be able to leave the cell or leave the plant leaf by through those guard cells, through the stoma. Lastly, I want to talk about those vascular bundles. So those are the xylem and the phloem, respectively. So what is the job of each of them? Well, xylem is going to be, responsible for causing or transporting water from the roots all the way upward against gravity to the leaves, right? So again, going back to our equation for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires water. Well, where is that water going to come from? It's going to come from our xylem, through our xylem, from the roots up to the leaves, the site of photosynthesis. Now, on the other hand, we are producing sugar in that leaf, right, via photosynthesis. That's the whole point of it. That's one of the points of it, right? So the phloem is the vascular bundle responsible for carrying those carbohydrates, those sugars that are made in the leaf from the leaves and down into the roots. Right, so that is what's going on there. So the xylem transporting the water that we need as a reactant in photosynthesis up to the leaves, the phloem carrying the sugars that are made in the leaf down to the roots for storage. And that is leaf structure.